just to tell us that. Okay, and that's all the housekeeping done. I will now hand you over to Berche Celik, who is going to chair this session.
Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the panel on how to decolonize media and culture research. The need to de-Westernize and decolonize media and culture research has been on the agenda of critical researchers from global South and North since the 1960s. Despite the achievements this scholarship has made in pushing the discipline to recognize the existence of heterogeneous experiences with media and related culture around the world, the impact on theoretical and methodological thinking in the field has been extremely limited. As this panel will explore, the language of English still remains to be the prime lingua franca of the discipline and hence blocks the dissemination of diverse epistemologies. The dominant theoretical and methodological paradigms used in the discipline largely focus on the Western experiences and history by rendering these structures to be universal and others ahistorical and provisional. And the majority of the so-called international media and culture studies present non-Western case studies from the universalist perspective of the West-centrism, where the non-Western cases confirm or disprove the universality of West-centric norms. As such, the discipline or the interdiscipline needs an urgent and comprehensive intervention from existing and emerging scholars to push the West-centric and colonial epistemological structures to move beyond the Euro-Atlantic orbit. Our distinguished speakers will respond to the question of how to do this in their brief talks. So our first speaker is Professor Usha Raman. She has a background in journalistic practice and health communications practice. And since 2010, she's a professor of communication at University of Hyderabad in Department of Communication. Professor Raman researches and writes about feminism, feminist and women media, health communications, journalism, digital communication, datafication and media education. And she was elected as the vice president of the International Association for Media and Communication Research for a 4-year term in July 2020. She will respond to this question of how to decolonize media and culture research by focusing on the issues such as what might be our new objects of study and what new languages and new conceptual frameworks might be used to understand and reveal them. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor Raman, today. Our second speaker is Dr. Moyo, who lectures in Department of Communication and Multimedia Design at American University of Nigeria. He recently published a book titled The Decolonial Turn in Media Studies in Africa and the Global South by Palgrave in 2020. It's a fascinating book tackling the issues that we will touch upon in our panel today. So I strongly recommend you to read it if you haven't already. I wish I had the print copy with me, but I read it online. So online or print, please read it when you have time. His talk will focus on the problem of coloniality in the discipline and how it is implemented in what he calls the cognitive empire. He would also talk about the resistance imaginaries against the universals of Western media theory and method in the discipline, by also touching upon the necessity of deprovincializing the Southern archive, silenced knowledges and theories to travel in space and time. Our last speaker, Anna Cristina Suzina, is Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Loughborough University in London. She's a specialist in communication and social change in Latin America with expertise in grassroots social movements and political communication, focusing on citizen appropriation of media, power asymmetries, and epistemologies of communication. Her current research concerns understanding youth media appropriation in the Amazon region. Anna recently wrote an article in the journal called Media, Culture and Society, which has attracted significant attention from the scholarly community in the discipline. In that article, she discussed how the use of English as lingua franca of the discipline plays an important role in the construction of a map of language. In her talk, she will elaborate these ideas and alternatives to the filtering role of English language within the discipline. So I thank all of our speakers in advance. You will be able to ask questions to them. If you just put your questions in the chat function. Usha Rahman, please, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Burçe, and thank you to the organizers of TechNIF for having me here. I'm happy to be part of this panel and to hear from the others as well. So if you just give me a minute, I'll share my screen. Yes, here it is. Yeah, does everybody see it? Oops, wait. If you don't mind, I'm going to just leave it as, not as full screen so that I can see what's going on the screen as well. But yes, so yeah, so thanks again, like I said, and I want to start by actually reflecting a little bit on how we got here. If many of you may have heard a very popular talk by Chimamanda Adichie, where she talks about the power of stories and the need for multiple stories from multiple points of origin. And she says, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that the surest way to erase or negate a people's history and identity is to begin their story with the word secondly. So I'd like us to think of, whatever histories of our discipline or, culture studies and media studies we offer to our audiences, we have to be aware that the point of origin that we choose is always going to be a secondly. And I think that's an awareness that the decolonizing frame really allows us to recognize that, that there could be much that happened before that we're not sufficiently aware of at the point of telling. So the story that I tell here, and after all, every academic talk is a form of storytelling with its own beginnings and endings, however tentative, the story must be taken as partial, incomplete, non-linear, fragmented, and of course, imbued with the flavors of my own personal academic journey. So just to kind of recap a little bit of the history, and something I call a quick and imperfect history. And many of you may already know of this, but I think it's just important to preface this panel with this idea. So in the decades after the Second World War, several scholars turned our attention to the way in which Western imperialism and settler colonialism had constructed the East, exhorting us to first understand and then shift the gaze to rethink the ways in which it came into being and how it produced and reproduced the world. Work on power and hegemony informed by Marxist ideas, by among others the Frankfurt School and later Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, as well as the strand of subaltern and cultural studies scholars like Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, pushed media studies and cultural studies scholars to focus on dismantling the dominant ways of seeing and building knowledge, and of broadening the field of study and the questions it asks, bringing into the fold cultures on the margins and new voices. The work of Stuart Hall, for instance, and the Birmingham School opened the way for a discourse that recognized race and ethnicity as an important part of this reformulation. In India, these ideas resonated with groups working on dismantling other structures of power that had been reinforced by colonialism, primarily of caste and class. But like Burçe just mentioned, it's hard to not see that much of the scholarship until the late 1980s or so, authors who were recognized, papers that were published, theorists who were cited, not only continued to come from Western centers of power, but were dominated by those who had historically held power, white, cis men in universities in UK and the United States. And even a cursory sweep of reading lists and syllabi from 30 or 40 years ago would show that where critical scholarship was included, it was still dominated by the work of white men from Europe and the Americas. And even as the term decolonization began to gain currency and visibility and real traction in academic and popular discourses, probably by the last decade of the 20th century, none of us would claim that it has become mainstream, even in the context where it is likely to have the most power, that is in the global South. So, what I have here on this slide are, just some of the names that that we often refer to. And in media studies, we could probably add names like Dallas Smith, Herbert Schiller, and so on. And not to dismiss the work that they have all done. In fact, it's been extremely important in getting us to shift the gaze, recognize where it comes from, and to argue for the shifting of the object of the gaze as well. So in the global South, of course, we've had scholars like Paulo Freire, who fueled some of us to take these ideas further and look for ways to recover histories and refashion identities that had been either erased or boarded over by colonialism. And as more people of color began to enter universities across the world and to gain visibility in those same Western academic centers, the influence of these ideas deepened and gradually also permeated global conversations. But again, as I said, not nearly as enough as we would like. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is to just talk briefly about three broad ways in which this project of decolonization is undertaken within Global South discourses. And some of these are not always generated in the Global South geographically, but certainly by scholars who position themselves as part of those communities. And each of these trajectories, of course, could be the subject of an entire seminar. So you'll have to treat this as, just a very quick overview. And the three spaces that I'm talking about are research and knowledge construction, curriculum and pedagogy, and activism and advocacy. And one can argue that these are all the spaces in which academics work. So to start with, if we had to think about the project of knowledge construction, so several scholars have talked about what they call epistemicide, right? Or the erasure of entire knowledge systems as a consequence of colonialism. And while by and large, we tend to think of this as a result of the imposition of Western research traditions and methods of inquiry that are rooted in the European Enlightenment, we might also argue that there are many other forms of erasure that we need to pay attention to. And in media and culture studies, this has prompted a reframing of the space of research, a turn to asking who and what has been left out of the project of knowledge generation, which knowledges have been privileged or marginalized, and which knowledges have actually completely been ignored in the project of knowledge construction. So studies of representation and media bias, of course, which started off a lot of the research in media and culture studies, gave us an understanding of what the colonial gaze has wrought. And valuable as these studies were and continue to be, they're only the start of a longer project of knowledge deconstruction and reconstruction. Most recently, the effort has been to build or rebuild knowledge structures from the ground up, to present the Global South not in contrast to the North, or as Rsch again said, not to use the universalizing discourse. And I'm really looking forward to what Last has to say about this, but to locate understanding within the local indigenous frameworks. So as Ashwin Punatambikar and Sriram Mohan point out, while referring to the need to understand, for instance, digital cultures is what they talk about as they emerge in South Asia, we need to move beyond looking at cultures of the Global South as being situated elsewhere. It requires that we privilege not only voices and experiences, but also the sense-making apparatus that may reside in cultures outside recognized centers of power. So I'd like to point to the volume on called Keywords for India. And I have the cover image here, edited by Peter D'Souza and Rukmini Bhaya Nair. And this offers, and I'm quoting, a discourse mapping of the present that pertains to India, certainly, but also to a global world desperately in need of new vocabularies. And what Keywords for India does is it uses Indian languages as the first point of reference. So we have, instead of English words as the beginning of our understanding of concepts. It offers a list of Indian words that allow us to understand Indian culture through the prism of Indian language. And I think we need more projects like this, right? And of course, we cannot get away from English as the interlocutor of global knowledge, because it would be difficult really to speak across boundaries without English. But if there is a way we can also insert into that conversation vocabularies that emerge from other languages, that might be one way to do it. So Mohan Datta and Mahua Pai also, who talk a lot about decolonizing media studies, they have said in their introduction to a special issue of the Journal of Communication Theory, and I'm quoting here, "Theorizing from the Global South draws on an ongoing project of recognizing the agentic capacities of people, communities, societies that have been and continue to be projected as lacking, backward, and without agency in colonial formations of knowledge production." So what we need to do is shift our recognition and shift our understanding of expertise, and actually allow the emergence of expert discourses from spaces that have otherwise not been recognized. And we know that this move is being reflected in research projects across the Global South, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and also to a lesser extent in communities of First Peoples in the Pacific region and in North America. And within India, this has also been about recognizing forms of dominance, such as Brahmanism, for instance, over knowledge structures and building spaces where alternative voices can emerge. So a lot of the decolonization process in Indian academia, for instance, has been about not just dismantling colonial knowledge structures, but also internal colonizations of knowledge and culture. So the next theme that I'd like to talk about is teaching and learning. And I think even though the topic and the focus of this conference is research, I think you cannot talk about research without also talking about where research gets taught, and where questions of research actually are sifted through and legitimized. So, as teachers, as supervisors of research, we have as much responsibility to look at how we teach research as how we do research. And here the kind of questions that we're asking is, who gets taught in terms of which names get taught as holders of research process knowledge, and what gets taught, right? So, for instance, going back to what Mohan Datta does, he talks about co-authoring with people that are giving him access to their knowledge. So to move away from extractive modes of research to modes of research that are more collaborative and cooperative, and that recognize that the people who, as researchers, we interact with to draw knowledge from are as important in our presentation of ideas. So in India, again, there are people who have been trying to bring new forms of pedagogy, to adapt critical pedagogies, for instance, that we draw from Paulo Freire and others, but to rethink them within the space of the Indian classroom. And again, when we think about the Indian classroom, it is fraught by all kinds of inequalities, and I'm sure this exists across the world. And we have people like Sharmila Rege, Sundar Sarukai, and Gopal Guru, who talk about the classroom, as Bell Hooks said, as a place of possibility, but to think about those possibilities within the hierarchies that exist within Indian society. And here I just wanted to point to two recent sort of pushbacks to critical research and decolonizing curricula in across the world. And many of you may know of the whole debate around critical race theory in the US, and the pushback from conservatives to teaching that in schools and educational institutions. And in fact, Trump calls it ideological poison. So clearly, decolonizing pedagogies have not reached the mainstream. There's still something that we have to really argue against, argue for. And in India, and I'm sure in many other cultures around the world, you have this use of the language of decolonization to actually institute a new kind of revisionism that celebrates a past that is actually as toxic as a colonial past. So it's not an easy task to decolonize the curriculum or to decolonize pedagogy. And then the last theme that I'd like to talk about is activism and advocacy. And I think possibly unlike in other trajectories of research, I think if you are a scholar engaged in decolonization of knowledge systems, of curricula, it's impossible not to be tuned in and not to contribute to the larger conversation around culture and media. And I think we've seen, especially in the past year, how these conversations have resulted in changing the conversation in the popular space. So the three pictures I have here are examples of that from India. So we have a publisher called Navayana that is consistently trying to push the boundaries of what we call acceptable knowledge, both in terms of the topic of study as well as in the form of presentation. So this book, Bhimayana, is the biography of Ambedkar, who I would say was one of those who was most responsible for introducing the discourse of caste into Indian public space. And it's a biography that is told from the point of view of a tribal community in using their idiom of art. And then we have media enterprises like Dalit Camera and resistance movements. And this image that I have here is of two tribal girls, and this community in central India was instrumental in, like the Keystone Pipeline, they were instrumental in protesting the institution of a project, an energy project in their lands. And I think these discourses draw from our understandings that come out of decolonizing theory and decolonizing our mindsets, actually. So I'm going to stop there, but actually just end by saying that as media scholars, particularly those who have this this interest in decolonizing our spaces, it requires that we scrutinize the methods, sources, sites, and dissemination of research, and build theory that draws on lived experiences and contexts of those in different pockets of the global South. And so I will stop there and happy to take questions once all the speakers have finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usha. Thank you so much. We will speak more after our other speakers speak. Now, can I leave the floor to you?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I would like to start my presentation slightly differently, but I think what comes out from Usha's talk is that basically our presentations, I think, will be mutually reinforcing. So that's very good. Where I think maybe I'm likely to repeat what she said, I will sort of like try and move on and talk to different things compared to what she has already covered. But the way I would like to start this talk is to situate and characterize coloniality as a planetary problem, which is very pervasive. And I think in trying to do so, I'm really sort of like trying to say coloniality goes beyond disciplines. It's something that is very, very pervasive. So to speak of the problem of coloniality is to deconstruct the bigger problem of modernity itself and the kind of a world system that it has created over the past 500 years. And the kind of system that it has created is one that is modern, colonial, capitalist, racial, patriarchal, and Christian-centric. It's a world system that is very pervasive, it's monocultural, it's unjust, it's inescapable, it's hegemonic, omnipotent and omnipresent. We live and speak from a particular position to this power structure. In other words, no one is able to escape its class, gender, race, spiritual, geographical, linguistic hierarchies. As a woman, you speak and live in a particular way in relation to this particular power structure. As a Black man, similarly, you also are affected in a different way. So that's one of the points that I would like to stress. Coloniality itself legitimates itself through the paradigm of difference, which basically rests on three legs, which I call the colonial matrix. First is the coloniality of knowledge, and then secondly is that of the coloniality of being, and lastly the coloniality of power. I'll try to quickly go through these three legs of the colonial matrix to say what they are, because I use them later to relate to the disciplinary problems of media studies. The coloniality of knowledge is really about the geo and body politics of knowledge. It is the view, sort of like the commonsensical and hegemonic view, that the West and the white men, and I'm using white men quite deliberately there, consciously, the West and the white men are the producers of knowledge, whereas the non-West and people of color are basically sources of raw data, superstitions. You know, they wallow in magic. These are not spaces of knowledge. You could speak of the epistemic line there. The coloniality of being is one that classifies bodies, regions, populations in a particular way. It discounts the humanity of the other. I'm talking here of Africa, Asia, South America, and so on. You could speak here of it in terms of the color line. People with no history, people with no knowledge, people with no science, and indeed without culture, with no language, scientific language, if you like. And then lastly, the coloniality of power speaks to the institutional domain of power, the media, the school, the universities, churches, and the state itself work basically to entrench the coloniality. For coloniality exists in and through temporalities as well. You could think of it in terms of slavery, imperialism, colonialism. All these represent coloniality in its most barbaric forms. And in modern day, you could speak of modernization, globalization, neoliberalism, and free market fundamentalism, which represent its most advanced and subtle forms, which are conceited and deceptive. It represents the chameleon-like character of coloniality, which is always mutating, it's always changing, it's a moving target, it's never static. So in the 21st century, we often speak as having ended slavery, rather slave trade and colonialism. But as Maldonado Torres would say, coloniality continues in schools, in universities, in books, and indeed in disciplines such as media and cultural studies. So I want to move now then to address the question of, so how can we decolonize media and culture research? For me, I think echoing again Usha, the strategy must be threefold. First is the coloniality of media theory and epistemologies. We need to target that. My argument here being that the function of theory is to reveal phenomena. But if the function of theory is to reveal phenomena, I think it goes without saying that it also conceals phenomena. The questions here being, what happens when we entirely depend on Western media theories as the South? And what can we see and what can we not see about the world and the West? Or even about ourselves when we depend as the South on Western media theories. The second point that I would like to tackle is that of the coloniality of research methods. I think Usha has already touched on that as well. Research is the medium through which we explore the world and the world. It's a medium through which we bring epistemology to ontology. So if we depend on Western methods, what happens to the knowledge that we produce, in some cases, about ourselves, our cultures, and so on? And lastly, I would like to speak to the coloniality of media, pedagogy, and curriculum. The question being, as far as these are concerned, how can we resolve the constant problem of the teacher and the student? Rather, how do we resolve the constant of a teacher-student problematic? So let me quickly go through the issues of theory. In my view, what I think Western media theories have exceedingly done well is to have scholars who live on the oppressed side of its global knowledge power structure to think and theorize media and their realities as if they lived on the unoppressed side. So Western theory does this by hiding its locus of enunciation, which is really about the geo and body politics of the subject that speaks. In Western theory, I'm arguing that this subject is always concealed and erased from its postulations, tropes, and tenets. It's invisible. The subject is invisible. So this creates the myth of non-situated ego politics of knowledge. The social location and epistemic location of the Western media theorist is always hidden. And this privileges Western media theorists' false claim to neutrality, objectivity, and universal validity. However, Western media theories lack the analytical impulse to deal with structural racism as we experience it in the South, to deal with colonial difference and indeed post-coloniality in the border. Inherently, they lack the capacity to imagine the life in the border in terms of the exteriority of modernity itself. No Western scholar, white scholar, can be able to imagine the border, the pain and frustrations of living in the border. So that's inherent. I think Du Bois talks of it as lacking the analytical impulse. So what is the task of the decolonial theorist? In my view, the decolonial theorist must decolonize and provincialize the Western media archive. What we need to do is basically to reject the claim of universal validity of Western theories and locate them within the province called Europe. They are particularistic in that sense. Secondly, I think what we need to do is to decolonize and deprovincialize the Southern archive. The fact that most of theories produced in the South are thought of as being particular to the South and lacking mobility to travel to the North and explain issues in the North is a fallacy. I think no theory should be rejected basically on its cultural origin, or on the terms of its cultural origin. Yes, no theory should be taken holistically, but all theories should be able to travel. So I think the Southern media scholar needs to end the mimicry and parrotry of the master. We need to reawaken silenced languages, cultures, histories, in order to gain a voice in academics. We need to consciously work against the disciplinary decadence, because if we are using Western theories, they become formulas which basically have no relation to our lived experiences, or maybe to a certain extent, a small relation to our lived experiences. That is called disciplinary decadence. And we need to consciously work against it through conscious media scholarship that is sensitive to its locus of enunciation and in relation to the subalternity of the colonial subject in terms of race, class, and gender. The second point the second issue I want to talk to is that of research methods. In decolonial thinking, research methodology and methods can be either liberatory or oppressive. no method is neutral or value-free. All methods serve a particular interest in the modern capitalist colonial patriarchal world system. So if you look at most of the research methods in media studies from post-Second World War, most of the methods are basically extractivist, as Usha was saying. They're exploitative. That's the framework. They are colonial in character. They speak to the interests of the market, of the state, and so on. So they have always served the interests of the empire, capital, and researchers, and so on. You walk into the community, you ask a few questions, and tomorrow you have a PhD. How that knowledge really fundamentally transforms and creates agency for the community is another question that extractivist methods don't care about. So I think in relation to methodology, the task of the decolonial scholar is to develop and use new decolonial methods that inoculate research methods from extractivist logic and the logic of the market. Decolonial research methodology must be liberatory. They must be emancipatory for the research subjects and communities that we engage with. They require, I would argue, deep cultivated relationships and slow ethnography, active engagement with communities, and empathy with the oppressed. They should aim to produce knowledge that transforms the lives of the researched. I think if I had time, I would have gone through what sort of methods am I talking about here. I'll just use one, for example, participatory action research, which is collaborative, is lateral, it encourages lateral relationships, horizontal relationships of equality instead of asymmetry. It's community-oriented. It seeks to generate transformative agency. If we took even Western methods and decolonized them and worked on them within the framework of participatory research, where we are trying to create agency for the communities, that could go a long way. Other methods would include indigenous research methods or decolonial ethnography, but I will not speak to that. Let me sort of like conclude by looking at pedagogy and the curriculum as one of the issues, as Usha has already also stated. From a decolonial thinking perspective, pedagogy and the curriculum are at the center of the politics of knowledge production between the teacher and the student. However, the solutions brought by the Western pedagogy have not sufficiently addressed the problems of coloniality that are embedded in the teacher-student relationship. I think the banking model has been sufficiently dismissed as domineering, colonial, and disempowering by critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy seems to be the only model that remains, but it also has problems. This is an argument that I also try to advance in my book. Much as it encourages critical thinking skills, problem solving skills, participation of the student, it still is embedded on the Cartesian logic of the rational north, the rational white bodies, and the irrational south, and irrational bodies of color, or black bodies as it were. It is still constructed within the Cartesian paradigm and the ego politics of knowledge. And the irrational others is normally the province of the BAM students. Those who have taught in the UK know that BAM is Black, Asian minorities. It's a province of women, it's a province of indigenous scholars. So those are problems that are still embedded in critical pedagogy. If a Black student enters class where critical people participate in critical contestations as people of different background and cultures, a Black student or a student of color has to leave their culture by the door in order to gain relevance. So oftentimes, even critical pedagogy, as it claims rationality and reason, we still have the problem of living our cultures in order to participate. So what is the solution to Western pedagogy problems? Let me just summarize. The decolonial border pedagogy, here pedagogy is sort of, the solution to Western pedagogy problem is that we need to develop a decolonial border pedagogy. Here pedagogy is sort of as a philosophy behind the teaching than the teaching method itself. Teaching must be informed by the philosophy of dialogue, and I am speaking here of trans-epistemic intercultural dialogue. It is really about the conversation of difference in terms of culture, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality and class. Conversation of difference and between differences. The teacher and the student are all situated readers of the word and the world. The teacher is as much a student as a student is as much a teacher. I think just to wind up and conclude, the curriculum in border pedagogy is overtly political. There is no pretensions about objectivity and so on and so forth. The aim is to create forms of political consciousness and agency that unmask structures of power and domination. It speaks consciously to the matrices of coloniality. I notice that my time is gone. I should try and stop here, and then I will speak to other issues on question time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lars. It's a great pleasure to listen to you and read your work. We will talk more. Now, Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I think you need to unmute, Anna.
Unmute, yeah.
Sorry. Someone needed to do this. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thank you, Burç, and thank you to all of you with us today. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. And then, well, I think it's interesting to speak, to be the last one speaking in this panel, because my colleagues already set the framework for what I will be saying. And I will just, to introduce my talk, I think it is important to say who am I and why I'm talking about this, because I think it makes a difference. I am, first of all, a migrant. So I am someone from the South living and working in the North, which means a lot of experiences. And my research topic, as well as my work field as a communication practitioner, has been since always justice and representation, and the issue of epistemologies grew longer and deeper after I came to the North, because I think the tension between the tension of getting spaces and testifying this power relations that Last was talking about was very different when I was in the South, when I was working in the South, and when I started to work in the North. So I want to let you know that I will be talking here from experience and from intellectual curiosity, and these both aspects are part of this debate. My approach to the topic of this panel is based on two ideas. One of the ideas is that the map is not the territory. It's a very known idea. And what I mean with this is that the way we communicate our research does not correspond to the whole knowledge we elaborated about the topic. It is a synthesis, it is always a synthesis. And it comes with a frame regarding what we want to highlight and the way we translate this knowledge into any kind of productions, being it academic articles, a participation in a seminar like this one, an interview. So there is always a framework in which we will be formatting this synthesis. So we need to think always that we are creating maps of knowledge with the production that we do. And the other idea that inspires me in this discussion is the McLuhan idea that the medium is the message. And the way I understand it is that McLuhan is trying to make us aware that the platform shows and frames takes part in the definition and absorption of the message. And what I want to add here is that the language we use to disseminate knowledge is always a frame. This is what we are going to discuss in this presentation. So it is a particular topic within the whole framework that my colleagues presented before. I will try to discuss how language conforms knowledge and how the imposition of certain language, today currently mainly English, has epistemological effects. And I will organize my presentation in 3 parts. I will summarize some ideas coming from some scholars, including myself. Then I will summarize what I consider as the most relevant impact of these evidences on research culture. And then as this panel asks how to, I will bring some examples of solutions and things that we could engage with to change and improve the situation. So the first reference that I want to present here is the article that Rsch mentioned in the introduction of the panel. That was one article that I published last year about the use of English as lingua franca. I will put all the links of the documents I will be mentioning on the chat after I finish. So this article turns around the discussion about the research that travels. That is the one that navigates times and places. And today it is increasingly the one communicated in English. And what is the impact of this? My concern in this article specifically is one, how the use of English as lingua franca can turn into a filter that sterilizes knowledge, defining the way this knowledge is validated under the Anglophone epistemological frame. So we are looking to language here as an epistemological frame, the way we think, the way we choose words, the way we present ideas is framed, like the idea of the map is framed by the format, by the language we use to present our ideas. And 2, I talk in this article about the issue of eloquence. And for me, there is a difference between adopting a common language in a way we can exchange knowledge. Wusha was talking about this. We do need common platforms for exchanging knowledge, but there is a difference between these and requiring or requesting native levels of English eloquence to anyone willing to engage in a conversation with global audiences. So what I'm trying to distinguish here is common understanding and filters. And the third element of this article is related with the concentration of power that also relates with what Lest was saying, the power that validates which research is able to travel. In this idea that there is a research that travels. In this sense, the mobility of research becomes concentrated in a few Western journals, mostly published in English, with few board members coming from different regional or cultural backgrounds, And then barriers related with format add to barriers related with content. And then the language aspect. This is what I call the language aspect of the phenomenon of communication so wide and rich. That was a very interesting pledge coming from one IMCR conference a couple of years ago. In this paper, I mostly use numbers regarding Latin America, like the one you can see now in this slide, but the pattern applies also to Asia, to Africa, and other regions of the world. The second reference that I use is one coming from a Colombian researcher that she's called Valeria Ramirez Castañeda. It was also published in 2020 in the journal in the journal PLOS ONE, and she presents a very particular case study with Colombian researchers, and the numbers are quite concrete. We can really see what is the impact of the dominance of English in communicating science. And she presents some numbers like writing in English takes the double of time in the preparation of manuscripts for these scholars. Translating them to English can cost a half of their month salary for one article. And well, we know it, that normally it is really very expensive, especially when journals ask for a native translation. And we have this big number of more than 40% of articles rejected because of English grammar. And she also presents the problem of local researchers lack access to most significant research published in English. And the third reference that I want to present to you is one coming from Afonso de Albuquerque and Tayane de Oliveira, two Brazilian colleagues who published a very interesting article in one Brazilian journal that is called Comunicação, Mídia e Consumo. The article is also available in English, and I will put as well the link on the chat. And they talk about the issue of recolonial in communication studies. And this idea of recolonial is very associated with academic capitalism. It is the way in which science is recolonized by metrics and productivity. And it is very, very related to publishing in international journals that end up being those same English-speaking journals in the USA and Europe. So this article will talk specifically about Latin America as well. And it talks about a situation in which Latin American production is very reduced in international fora, and it happens together with the increased search for establishing English as a lingua franca. What are the impacts that from these discussions, from these debates, what are the impacts that we can identify in general in the research culture? First of all, I want to point to the issue of domesticated epistemologies. And in this article that I published, I mobilized the work of Karen Bennett, which I find very, very insightful about the way a lingua franca may turn into a tool for domesticating epistemologies. And she associates languages with worldviews and highlights the way that the way one constructs an argument carries along a structure of acknowledging and thinking that is strongly deformed, if not completely erased, when the referential function of language prevails over interpersonal or aesthetic features. And I come back here to the aspect of eloquence. Imposing native levels of any language goes way beyond requiring skills for communicating clearly. And this, I want to make a mention here that one thing that we are talking mainly about English because it is the most prevalent language in science communication today, but it does also apply to any other language. I've just had an experience with a Spanish journal in which the editors were very, very harshly criticizing the Latin American Spanish and requiring proofread from Spanish native from Spain to validate the texts. So, I mean, every time we use a language as a validation tool, we are touching this issue of domesticating epistemologies. The other problem is this new or this revealed idea or organization between center and peripheral knowledge. Adopting English as the language of the research that travels implies the definition of Western journals as a kind of center of knowledge and their rules as those that should apply to all. So based, again, I'm mobilizing Karen Bennett here. Based on her studies analyzing translation patterns, she argues that the English academic discourse determines what is considered knowledge and how it should be presented. In Latin America, critical scholars discuss for many years how it is hard to overcome the idea that regional and local studies are more than laboratories to apply central and dominant theories. And it connects a lot with what Les was saying. So, and it relates also with the idea of domestication, because in Latin America, we also see that this dynamics of looking for this centralized journals and places for disseminating science, they come back domesticating the local production as well. And the third element of this, the third impact that I want to summarize here is that how it make inequalities deeper in terms of access of knowledge, which means that instead of a common place that a lingua franca would be supposed to trigger, we are increasing barriers to disseminate science and to access science. We see it through the lack of access to this highly qualified research, because global journals or these Western journals frequently have paywalls. And also, reading English is not spread in all these regions. So if all these researchers concentrate their publications, their high qualified research in these journals, we are creating a lot of difficulties to everybody who cannot read in English or pay to access these materials. There is a lack of valorization of local journals, which has consequences on their volume of readership and funding, and also on the interest of international researchers to publish there. So there are many, many very interesting regional journals. I know a lot of them in Latin America, and I'm sure that there are a lot of others in Africa and Asia, and even in different places in Europe. But the interest in publishing in these journals is related as well with these dynamics. And to answer to the panel with the question about what we can do, I am here summarizing a couple of principles and examples that we could and should think about engaging with. There are some aspects or some measures that we could engage individually, and this is related with principles. So Bennett, she talks about alternative networks of knowledge, and she's talking here about regional and language networks. So how important is to conserve regional exchange in a way that we keep high quality research circulating in different regions, as well as circulating in global platforms. Bennett, she also talks about resistant translation in order to guarantee quality in terms of reading, but preserving epistemological traits of manuscripts originally written in other languages. And Rao talk about mindful inclusiveness, and here she's talking mainly with people working in editorial boards and as peer reviewers, and many of us do this work or will do this work during our career. So how can we look less to grammar or to aspects of this English discourse frame, and more to the importance of getting access to the knowledge one article is proposing. So it is about assuming that there is power embedded in the demands of eloquence. And these are like things that we can do individually or in our research centers, in our universities, in the journals we work with. And then there are some platforms, some collective platforms that we can engage with. I believe this issue of language is growing in many fora, and some of the initiatives that are being organized still need our participation to guide them to the right direction. One of these initiatives is the Helsinki Initiative of Multilingualism, and it talks about keeping locally relevant research alive. It talks about disseminating research results in local language to create impact. So it is an initiative that talks with that gives importance to the dialogue with society in different languages. And it is also about protecting infrastructure of scholarly communication in national language. What I was talking about, how the moment we do not value these local regional journals, that they tend to disappear. So this initiative also talks about this, about protecting these infrastructures of alternative networks of knowledge. In our university, at Loughborough University, there is already one small initiative taking place in our code of responsible metrics. We already talk about the recognition of the fact that most citation counting tools are inherently biased towards English language publications, and that this should not penalize other researchers doing research in other languages. And in the article from Albuquerque and Oliveira, there are many initiatives in Latin America that I think can be visited because they are very interesting. And to end, I want to mention an European initiative called Coalition S that is very oriented toward open access publication and supporting researchers and institutions for doing it. So my end of conversation is about the need for everyone to engage with these individual and collective initiatives and try to make a difference in the way we produce and then we distribute knowledge in science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. So I can see that like there are a couple of questions or comments in the chat function, but if you want to add your questions and comments, you can now. Would it be possible for you to? Yeah, great.
I was looking for it.
Great. Okay. So there's so many things to talk about right now, but I'll start with the question that we have in the chat function. It is from Abi Weaver, and they say the idea of empathy is really interesting and something I think is still very complex and addressed very little, along with kindness in the academy. How can empathy and kindness fit into a research model? What does it look and sound like? And how do we produce research through empathy and kindness? And what kind of listening, collaboration does it suggest in practice? So I'd like to tag my question along with it because we don't have so much time to discuss. But, each of us are from different regions, and we work on different regions. According to some, we do area studies, right? Which is like excluded from the generic studies of media or history or whatever. And then there is the area studies. We also know that there is a sort of like hierarchy within regions as well, in terms of like circulation of knowledge. For instance, when you look at history, media history, Latin America has some presence, India to a certain extent, South Asia some presence, but Africa and Middle East, where I work on, is just almost non-existent. So there is also hierarchy within regions. So I was wondering, like, one issue is empathy, and the other issue perhaps is like collaboration between different, global South. The idea of global South is based on a critical engagement with, between oppressed and subaltern populations and scholars. Lust talks a lot about this in his book, like liberal internationalisms. There's so many international works, but they're not really international in a sense, in terms of producing critical knowledge and solidarity. So I would very much like each of you, if you could just like, elaborate on this and share what your thoughts are with us.
Can I very quickly just comment?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So just to respond to Abby's question about empathy and kindness, and I think I think we can tie that with some of the ideas that Anna actually talked about in relation specifically to the hegemony of English, right? So, for instance, when you are in the field, and I think Mohan Datta and his team actually do a great job of incorporating empathy into their field research practice. And they do this through by looking at the people they are working with as collaborators in research at every step of the way, so including publication. So they enter the field with the idea of, with the framework of, let's understand this, and people who are talking to us are experts as well. And so beyond just getting consent for doing the research, they get consent for publication, and now they're moving towards a publication model where key informants from the field are also co-authors. So in a way, I mean, I don't think it fully answers the question of empathy and kindness, but I think how do you use this idea of kindness without being patronizing is another question, right? So, but I think one way to do it might be to use this model of moving away from the extractive mode to a more consciously collaborative mode in field work.
Yes, can I chip in as well?
Yes, please, Lastya.
Okay, yes. For me, empathy would look like this. To begin with, I think one, as a researcher or even a teacher, has to deeply reflect on who they are in terms of new identities in the process of knowledge production. What new identities can we think of? Often we go there as the knower. We ask people as the, there's that assumption that, even in the power relations between the interviewer and the interviewee, there's that sort of like unwritten and unsaid power relationship that the indigenous person or the person from the South you're interviewing already has this disposition that you know more and you just want to sort of like add in whatever they have to say. So we have to reflect deeply about the relationships in the process of research and even the methods that we use, as I said. But beyond that, I think for me, the question of transculturality, the ability to transcend your own ethnocentric prejudices that you may have. I think no one is able to do that, but it's a conscious effort to be able to transcend what you grew up knowing, what you were told when you were young until you have actualized as an adult. So it's a long journey, it's a long process, but transculturalism is one of the fundamental things in trying to create deep cultural, deep cultivated relationships with the researched.
Last, would you like to say something about this liberal international?
I think I'll end there.
Hello?
Sorry, is Les going to say anything else?
Oh, I was wondering whether he would also like to comment on this liberal internationalisms and how it works and how we can just work against it.
The what, sorry, Bess? I couldn't catch that.
Liberal internationalisms that
Yes, I think one of the major problems that we are facing as scholars of the Global South, and I'm really speaking here not in the geographic sense, even for those, the South in the North and so on. One of the major problems that we are having to deal with is the false options that are given by, I would say, perhaps the postmodern scholars who are sitting in Europe. These are options like internationalism or internationalization of media studies. And I'm calling them false options because they do not speak to the fundamental problem of the hierarchies in the knowledge production between the North and the South, between the West and the non-West. Often they just create, they confuse inclusion and participation for acceptance and equality. I think what the Global South is pushing for is to say, we can think in our own terms. We don't need technologies as such. We are celebrating globalization, but we want to think of it as globalization from below, where we are coming into the discourse representing none other than ourselves. And the falsehood of internationalism, for me, liberal internationalism, is that it conceals the fact that its geographies of reason intersect with other forms of internationalism like imperialism and colonialism and so on. That is often hidden, and those who write within that trope tend to emphasize the question of, oh, now we all have access to technologies, we now have a voice and so on. And they consider the aspect that there are these convergences between imperialism and colonialism and liberal internationalism.
Thank you so much. Anna, we have,
Yeah, I will try to be very brief because I think this idea of empathy and kindness, it is very, very related with what you said, Bertrand, that is collaboration. And I think this is related with all stages of research. Like when we are in the field, how can we look to it as a collaboration? Usha talked about co-authoring. How many opportunities do we have to co-author things? Not just for this main mainstream journals, but to other platforms as well. But bring these people, bring these voices to different places. I think this is about empathy and kindness, like, and Les was just saying about hidden things. Letting these sources of knowledge hidden is a way of adhering to this project that is not kind, that is not empathetic. So the opposite, being empathetic, being kind, is about putting these knowledges in light and giving name to them, or sometimes giving out the idea of giving names, like in the past, signing documents as collective. No one knows who is behind the signature. I think we need some more collective production in terms of we built it together, so there is no one authorship. And the last thing is that we talk about this fight monetization, fight capitalism in academy. We are part of this. So how can we think of strategies of doing research, publishing research that do not answer just to the numbers? What other things can we do? Translating, co-authoring things, participating in fora that are not very popular but need our presence there as well. So I think we can add this to our programs.
Thank you so very much for an amazing discussion. I hope that we will continue this, perhaps at IMCR, Usha, in the coming.
Yes, next year. Maybe we do a panel next year.
Yes, let's do that. Let's do a panel together. Yeah. There's so much to talk about. Thank you so much, everyone. So we are already late and we lost some of the attendees, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Berta, for organizing this.
Yeah, lots to think about. Yeah. Okay, great.
Dan, do you want to say something? No.
Yeah, just quickly. Thank you all for attending. The Technique team have asked me to just remind all attendees of the Back to the Future pub quiz, which gets started in about 5 minutes. I'm just putting the details there. Which usefully hasn't copied the hyperlink. So if you just give me 1 second, I'll pop the link to that in the chat as well. And you'd all be very welcome to join there and also use that as an opportunity to continue your discussions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.